This week we're covering development of the child from conception through childhood. And a lot of students don't understand why this is part of a psychology class, but this is a very important part of psychology. Some psychologists just focus their work strictly on development, but it also has clinical applications as well. So if you're a child psychologist and someone comes to you and they're complaining that their child isn't talking when that child is 3 years old, is that normal? How about a 12-month-old that isn't toilet trained? Is that normal? Or a 9-month-old that isn't talking? Well, all of these stages of development are very important. And when we start in childhood, we really start really at the beginning of childhood in conception. And again, think of psychology as cognition and behavior, and cognition and behavior follow a very specific pattern. So, for psychologists, we've already talked a lot about the nature versus nurture debate. And I hope I've made the impression with you that it's not nature versus nurture, and that it's always nature via nurture. So you'll have genetic contributions and environmental factors that'll shape those. And now with the field of epigenetics, we know that nurture, or the environment, impacts our genes and has the ability to turn genes on and off. So there's Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen. You might know those two famous actresses that are identical twins, but are they alike? Maybe you know something about their adult life. Maybe they're a little different. So this process of maturation, so this is what we call development, and it's an orderly unfolding of certain patterns of behavior, like language acquisition or walking, but it follows a very specific order. It's in accordance with genetic blueprints. So this is a biologically determined sequence, and it occurs even if children are not encouraged to complete all the steps in the right order. So if you think about a child and how they learn to walk, well, they'll start in a crib, and maybe in the crib they'll roll over in the crib. That's typically the first thing that you'll see. And then the child will sit up. After they sit up, then they'll crawl. Then after they'll crawl, they'll stand. Once they stand, they can walk with assistance, and then they can walk on their own, and then eventually they'll be able to run. So once in a while a child skips one of those steps, but it's typically follows that exact order. So is this a continuous development, or is it stages of development? Well, if we remember the behaviorists or learning psychologists, that those psychologists view development as a gradual, continuous process. However, there's other psychologists that would disagree with them. So there's B.F. Skinner. And the learning psychologists would say that the mechanisms that govern development are relatively constant through a person's life. So the way that we develop is that we accumulate experiences, and development is seen as quantitative. So it follows a continuous pattern of growth. And that really, if you look at older people versus younger people, the major difference is that the older people have experienced more in life, so they've learned more. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I mean, does that sound right to you? In contrast, other psychologists emphasize development as being a discontinuous process that occurs in a series of steps or stages. This is very different. And this is Piaget here. We're going to talk about Piaget a lot. Actually, you need to read about Piaget, and then we'll have some separate Piaget-inspired videos posted. So when we think of the opposite of continuous or categorical development, we're going to talk about stages of development. This is a concept that we use to describe how people's thinking and behavior are organized and directed during a particular period in their life. If you look at little kids that are like the same age, like say, take like 3-year-olds, it's interesting that they make similar cognitive mistakes. And Piaget was studying intelligence, and he made this observation. And so Piaget became one of the most famous stage theorists, and he interprets the difference between children and adult as being qualitative in nature. And he would say that the differences are due to distinctions in the kind and nature of experiences, so that you'll see a child's development and growth in steps versus a continuous process. In development, there's critical periods. Critical periods are times in development when an organism, so that'd be like a person or an animal, must experience certain kinds of social or sensory experiences in order for normal development to take place. So if proper experiences are not provided at the right time, later experiences will not be able to make up for the earlier deficiencies that were lost during that critical period. Now, psychologists that talk about critical periods oftentimes cite animal research for their support. Let me give you an example of this. So this is Konrad Lorenz. He was a zoologist from Austria. Let's watch a little video of Konrad Lorenz here in a second. Before we do that, I want you to know what this process is called. It's imprinting. Remember that word. That's a good vocabulary word. So certain infant animals, especially like ducks and geese, learn to follow or approach the first moving objects that they see. So if you think about like ducks, think of ducklings, and what do they do with their mother duck? They kind of get in a line and they follow them. Well, there's a critical period, which is like, let's see, I think it's 12 to 17 hours for geese, in which the object that they are exposed to at that time, after hatching out of their egg, is imprinted on the ducks or geese, and they think that that is their mother. So what Lorenz did was, and here, think psychology, not ethology. This is a good video off of YouTube. Was he exposed himself to the geese, and what he wanted to do was see the attachment behavior of the geese after hatching. And Lorenz used himself, so he became the mother of these geese. So he took eggs and he divided them into two groups. One of the groups was hatched by their mother and immediately began following her around. The other group was hatched in an incubator, but without the mother, they began to follow Lorenz. Here's some pictures of him with the geese following him. Even if Lorenz placed the little baby geese in a box so that they were separated, they would split out and follow either the mother goose or Lorenz himself, depending on who they were imprinted on. This was really important. And although he used that name imprinting first, earlier scientists had made similar investigations. All right, now another famous psychologist in this area, besides Lorenz, is Harlow. And what Harlow did was experiments with rhesus monkeys. So he would take baby rhesus monkeys and deprive them of contact comfort, or like the comfort that they would have with their mothers during early development. And he really looked at emotional and social impairments as a result of this. And he found that these traits would persist into adulthood even after the imposed isolation ended. And so some monkeys were kept in total isolation, other monkeys were allowed to see other monkeys but not have any contact with them. Now, before I play this video here showing Harlow's experiments, I have to tell you that every time I watch these, it's kind of upsetting to me. It's hard to see like the baby monkey in this research paradigm. However, the results of Harlow's studies had a profound impact on how we treat developing infants in the United States. So think about infants that were kept in orphanages like in the 1920s or 30s and how they were treated. This research really changed that. And it really shows the importance of secure attachment between a caregiver and an infant. Here's this video.
Newborn rhesus monkeys will grow up not in accordance with nature, but in the controlled atmosphere of a laboratory, where all the psychological influences of childhood can be duplicated. In a classic continuing study, infant monkeys are removed from the mother at birth and raised in semi-isolation. Other individuals can be seen and heard, but there is no physical contact, no interaction. Mother is a bit of plastic and shaggy cloth, a doll with no life of its own, but capable of nourishing the life of an infant. The monkey will come to depend upon this doll to satisfy basic necessities of life. Not only nourishment, but a deeper psychological need for comfort and security. In primate infants, there is an instinctive need to cling to another body, soft and warm. Food or security, which is motherhood's stronger appeal? Alongside a warm, familiar mother of cloth, is a stark wire doll set up as nothing more than a feeding machine. The young monkey is placed deliberately on a cloth mother which has no milk to nourish him, but fulfills some fundamental needs. This experiment revolves around one simple question. Will the infant monkey switch his affection to a wire mother which offers food and life itself? Only when forced by hunger does he loosen his grip and begin to yield to nature's most powerful internal drive. From the wire mother he derives one thing, nourishment. No warmth, no comfort, no feeling of security. After feeding, he returns to spend up to 22 hours a day near the only mother he knows. From this inanimate object, the infant derives all the security and mother love he needs. He can, if also exposed early to other young, grow into a normal, well-adjusted adult.
Okay. So, what about humans? What if you raised a baby in isolation? Are they going to have the same development as a child that's raised in a normal environment? Well, Actually, I mean, I'm not going to show these videos in class, but if you Google feral children, and there's lots of examples of these. There's a Russian woman whose name is Oksana. If you look at YouTube for these videos, you'll see lots of children that, I mean, this is horrific, and you got to remember that, you know, people do some really terrible things, but there's been a lot of children that have been raised in deplorable conditions with zero isolation, locked in a basement or a shed in the backyard. This woman, Oksana, was raised by dogs in a kennel in her backyard. Well, what happens to them? Well, fortunately, humans are a little more resistant, and even if they miss critical periods, oftentimes can develop those skills later. It's a little different in humans versus animals. So in humans, though, the first 6 months are believed to be a very critical period for human development, and in those periods, it's really critical for certain things to happen for healthy emotional and social adjustment. But again, the research for this is really inconsistent. Now, I mean, don't attempt this. Like, you don't have to not take care of your kids in the first 6 months or the first 2 years. But humans are a little more resistant to those critical periods. So most non-human mammals, this is a good example. You might have cows or have seen other mammals lick their babies shortly after they're born. Well, many mammals will reject their young if they're deprived from being with them after the first few hours after birth. And we'd like to think that's important for humans too. I mean, we would like to have a newborn child be with their mother shortly after birth, but again, the research is a little sketchy on this. So in humans, the parent-child relationship seems to be malleable. It can change or be molded over time. But the bottom line is that evidence suggests that most effects of adverse early experiences can be modified or overcome to some degree by later experiences. Okay, so how is a baby conceived? Well, if you don't know that at this point, I'm not going to tell you. So you might want to hit up Google for that one, or call your parents at this point and ask them. But we do need to talk about some specific things. Actually, the textbook covers that. You should review that if you're confused on that process. But we need to identify a couple things in regards to genetics. The first is genotype versus phenotype. The genotype is the actual genes that an individual inherits at conception. The phenotype, in contrast, are the physical characteristics or behavioral characteristics that result from the expression of various genotypes. The best examples would be like brown eyes or blonde hair. The phenotype is different from the genotype. Again, the phenotype is the characteristic that's actually expressed. Now, heterozygous versus homozygous. So this is for the genotype. Heterozygous means that the genotype contains different genes for a trait. So you'll get a gene for brown eyes and blue eyes. Homozygous, on the other hand, homo means same. Homozygous means that the genotype consists of the same genes for a trait, like both are brown-eyed genes. Dominant genes are genes that prevail when they're paired with a recessive gene, so they're always expressed in the phenotype. And the recessive genes are the genes that are expressed in the phenotype only in the absence of a dominant gene, or it has to be paired with a similar recessive gene. Now, sometimes you'll hear of autosomal disorders. Autosomal disorders are any disorders that occur on any of the 23 pairs of chromosomes except for the sex-linked chromosomes. So sex-linked inheritance is a genetic transmission involving genes that are carried only on the X chromosome. So females carry 2 X chromosomes and males have an XY pair. And so for females, there's a redundancy here. They have an extra X chromosome just in case they missed anything on the first X. That's why sex-linked disorders are predominantly found in males. Here's an example of hemophilia. Hemophilia is a you can see this is a recessive gene here, and this is a sex-linked disorder. So it's going to be on an X chromosome. Here we have a carrier mother that has the gene for hemophilia, and that X chromosome is going to be passed down to the children. So you'll get an X chromosome here, X chromosome here, but over here, these 2 children are the only ones that get the recessive gene for hemophilia. Now you would have a normal father here. So he has to contribute one of the X chromosomes to the daughter, because the daughter's going to have 2 X chromosomes. And that X chromosome has the normal genetic material, so this becomes a normal child without hemophilia, although they carry the gene for hemophilia. And unfortunately, this son here has to get an X chromosome from the mother, and then the Y chromosome comes from the father, and there's no genetic material here on the Y chromosome that is going to make up for the recessive chromosome here, and this child here is going to have hemophilia. Another disorder that is transmitted progressively, transmitted genetically, and it is a progressive disorder or progressive neurological disorder that destroys brain cells in adults, is called Huntington's disease. And so the symptoms of Huntington's disease are jerky, uncontrollable movements, loss of balance, intellectual impairment, and emotional disturbances like depression or irritability. Sometimes the jerky, uncontrolled movements are described as being snake-like or chorea, like a dance, and they'll call it like Huntington's chorea, and the patient will kind of writhe around. This disease doesn't show up until you're about 35 or 45 years old, and unfortunately it's fatal, and by that time a lot of people have already had children, and so they'll pass along the disease to their children, and you'd have a 50% chance of inheriting the disease. So this is not a sex-linked disorder. This is an autosomal disorder that's found on chromosome number 4. And there's genetic testing that can be done to identify Huntington's disease. But I want you to think of the ethical implications of that. I mean, would you want to know that you had Huntington's disease? What if your insurance company could test for it? Would you want to know before you have children? What if you found out that you had Huntington's disease after you had children, and then you had the knowledge that there's a 50% chance that your children are going to have Huntington's disease? So here, Huntington's disease is a dominant allele, and here you can see that it's passed on to these 2 children here. So if the allele is present, the child will have Huntington's disease. Another disorder is called Phenylketonuria, or PKU, and this is a disease that's caused by a recessive gene that results in the absence of an enzyme that's necessary to metabolize milk protein called phenylalanine. And this unmetabolized phenylalanine converts to phenylpyruvic acid, which, when it builds up in your system in excess, can damage a baby's developing nervous system and can lead to mental retardation and other disruptive symptoms. Now, there's screening tests for PKU, and it's mandatory in the United States. And if you test positive for PKU, it doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. You just have to be placed on a diet where you won't be exposed to phenylalanine. And again, milk is the worst source for phenylalanine. There's a lot of it, but there's lots of other foods. Here, this is kind of a confusing chart, but the stuff on the outside is not good. Here, you can see milk right here. But here's the other foods that you have to avoid, and you'd want a diet that are phenylalanine-free foods. Down syndrome is another genetic disorder, and this is characterized by marked mental retardation as well as a lot of distinctive physical traits like a short stature, a flattened skull and nose, and an extra fold of skin over the eyelid, a short neck and protruding tongue, and sometimes webbed fingers or toes. And what happens in Down syndrome is this is another autosomal disorder. It is not sex-linked, and this is with the 21st chromosome pair. Sometimes Down syndrome is called trisomy 21, or instead of having 2 pairs of chromosomes, you'll actually have 3. Okay, so it takes 9 months of development for a child from conception to birth, and there's 3 stages of prenatal development. Natal means birth. So if you see pre, it means before birth. Perinatal means around birth. Postnatal means after birth. So in the germinal stage, this is the first of 3 stages in prenatal development of a fetus. And this stage spans the first 2 weeks after fertilization. This is also known as the zygote stage. The next stage is the embryonic stage. This stage lasts from the beginning of the 3rd week to the end of the 8th week after fertilization. Here you see really fast growth and differentiation of the major body system and vital organs. And this is a really critical stage for development. In the embryonic stage, you have a great susceptibility to teratogens, or things that can affect the development prenatally. And unfortunately, a lot of things go wrong in the embryonic stage. And here you can have spontaneous abortion, where the pregnancy is aborted naturally, and that happens typically because of genetic abnormalities. A fetus is a term that's used to describe an unborn infant during the period from the beginning of the 3rd month after fertilization until birth. And we call that the fetal stage. That's the 3rd stage, the last stage of prenatal development, from the 3rd month until birth. And here, bone and muscle tissue form, and the organs and body systems continue to develop. By the end of the 4th month, fetal movement might be felt, and in this stage, the fetus depends on the mother for nutrients, oxygen, and waste elimination. However, the fetus has its own separate blood supply. So if we look at a newborn's brain, So after the child is born, what's their brain like? Well, actually, they have all the neurons that they'll ever have. A newborn's brain has a ton of neurons. And there's actually a lot of connections between those neurons. And the brain actually needs to go in and take connections out. So at birth, the brain is only about 25% of its adult weight. But think about what a huge percentage that is compared to the weight of the body of the newborn baby. By 6 months, the brain is 50% of its adult weight. And at 2 years, 75%. And then by 5 years, you reach 90%. So at 6 months, you hit 50%. So that's one reason that babies have such big heads compared to their body. And during this period of rapid growth, you have neural networks that become increasingly complex. And so that requires exposure to certain things. And remember, neurons that fire together wire together. And if neurons aren't communicating with each other, the connections between those neurons are going to be lost. And the brain develops in a very orderly fashion after birth. The skills that a newborn acquires come in a very specific order that's laid out by genetic blueprints. So the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex develops rapidly. Children learn to control their body, and infants progress to voluntary control over motor movements. So a lot of researchers have asked the question, do our early experiences influence the way that our brains develop? There's this really famous study that was done by Rosenzweig and his colleagues. And he took rats and he raised them in two different environments. An enriched environment versus what he called an impoverished environment. I don't like that he used the term impoverished, because that implies like poor to me. He should have just said not enriched. So he took one group of rats, raised them with other rats, in like a rat Disneyland. I'll show you a picture of this in a second. So their cage had all sorts of toys and junk in it for them to play in. And then other rats were raised in cages, like in total isolation. And then he looked at the brains of the rats afterwards. And what they found was that the rats that were raised in an enriched environment, their brains were actually heavier than those of the rats raised in the impoverished environment. And what it is not neurons, like the number of neurons, but it's a density of connections between those neurons. And so this is most pronounced in the cerebral cortex, and the weight difference was 4%. There was also a significant increase found in acetylcholinesterase and cholinesterase in the brains, and those indicate synapsing in the brain. So here's an example of a normal environment. This would be an impoverished environment. Notice the walls on the cages so the rats can't see out. And then here, this would be an enriched environment with all sorts of toys and blocks and other rats. What I call Rat Disneyland. I think if I had a choice, I'd want to be raised in that environment. But this Rosenzweig study was very controversial, and people took the results way out of context and tried to use this to justify that people that were like wealthier would have superior brain functioning to those raised in an impoverished environment. And I really need to stress that that's not true. So in human beings, no way. Who are you to tell another person that their environment was enriching versus impoverished? I've lived in some very poor neighborhoods that were incredibly enriching, and I would disagree with Rosenzweig. Now the last person we need to talk about is Jean Piaget. And again, Piaget was studying intelligence in children, and he noticed, this is in France with a guy named Binet, he noticed that children were making very similar mistakes based on how old they were. And this led to Piaget's conceptualization of stages of development. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you about this. You have to go to the textbook to learn about the stages of development. But I've also posted a video that shows the stages of development, and I need you to read, study, and then look back at that video so you understand the different stages. Piaget has had a huge lasting impact on psychology, and his theory of cognitive development has provided tremendous insight into the minds of children. Piaget's work is incredibly important, not just in psychology, but also in other fields like education. Piaget believed that children's cognitive strategies are age-related, and that as a child gets older, their thinking matures as well, regardless of the specific nature of what they're thinking about. So you need to go to the book and you need to study and memorize these different stages of development. So that's it for this chapter. This is tough. There's a lot more material in the book that you need to cover through reading, and this will get us through childhood. Next week, we're going to take it from childhood on. So not only do you need to understand Piaget's work, but also Erik Erikson, understand his 8 stages of development, go through those very specifically, and I'll try and find a video to post on those, although I don't know if I have one available, so I can't promise you that. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me or ask questions in discussions, and maybe your classmates will have answers. But again, this material is very important to the field of psychology and in life in general. So let me know if you have any questions.